The generational gauntlet. Levit's Late Night Reckoning. The gleaming studio lights of The Late Show cut through the artificial fog, casting long shadows across America's most influential late-night stage. As the crimson on-air sign illuminated, an unmistakable electricity permeated Studio 50 at the Ed Sullivan Theater. Tonight was different. The typical celebrity promotional circuit had been interrupted by something far more consequential. A collision of political worlds that would reverberate through media ecosystems for weeks to come. Karoline Leavitt, the Gen Z wunderkind tapped as White House press secretary, stood backstage, mentally rehearsing the countless briefings and confrontations that had prepared her for this moment. At 26, she represented more than just an administration. She embodied a generational shift in political power that threatened the very foundations of entertainment media's hold on cultural narratives. 2 minutes, Ms. Leavitt, a production assistant murmured, clipboard clutched nervously to chest. The young press secretary nodded, her composed exterior betraying nothing of the strategic calculations racing through her mind. In the adjacent green room, Stephen Colbert adjusted his signature rimless glasses, reviewing last-minute notes with his writers. Once the undisputed king of political satire, Colbert had watched his cultural capital slowly erode as younger voices increasingly challenged his brand of establishment humor. Tonight's booking wasn't merely content, it was an attempt to reassert relevance with a demographic slipping through his fingers. She's polling at 73% favorability with under 30s, his producer reminded him, sliding a tablet of fresh polling data across the table. That's 17 points higher than you. Colbert's jaw tightened imperceptibly. The late-night landscape had shifted beneath his feet. Jon Stewart's return to television had siphoned away his intellectual credibility, while younger hosts commanded growing slices of digital engagement. Levit represented everything changing in his world: youth, conservatism wrapped in millennial aesthetics, and, worst of all, an immunity to the ironic detachment that had been his weapon of choice for decades. "We're ready for you, Ms. Leavitt," the floor director called, breaking the tension of the final pre-show moments. As the house band launched into a rendition of a pop song cannily chosen to appeal to younger viewers, the audience's anticipation crystallized into physical energy. Camera operators pivoted, technicians adjusted levels, and producers whispered last-minute instructions through headsets. This wasn't merely television. It was a battleground where cultural power was actively being contested. The studio audience, a carefully curated mix designed to project youthful diversity while maintaining the show's traditional liberal bent, stirred with unusual anticipation. College students who had secured tickets months in advance leaned forward in their seats. Media insiders who had called in favors to witness this confrontation firsthand discreetly activated recording apps on silenced phones. Leavitt stepped into the wings, her tailored navy suit both professional and subtly patriotic, a visual reminder of the office she represented. Her Gen Z identity wasn't just biographical trivia but a tactical advantage. She had grown up watching figures like Colbert, studying their techniques, understanding their rhythms. While they had been perfecting their approach to an aging demographic, she had been mastering theirs while developing countermeasures. "Please welcome White House Press Secretary, Karoline Leavitt." Colbert's voice carried the practiced enthusiasm of thousands of introductions, but close observers noted a subtle tightness around his eyes. As Leavitt emerged into the blinding light, the audience eruption caught even veteran producers off guard. The applause wasn't merely polite, it carried genuine excitement. Young audience members rose to their feet, smartphones aloft, capturing a moment they intuited was significant beyond entertainment. In that electric intersection, between Colbert's practiced sardonic mastery and Leavitt's youthful institutional authority, something profound was happening to America's political discourse. The traditional gates were being stormed not by outsiders, but by insiders, who spoke the language of a generation increasingly skeptical of the very media they consumed. Leavitt crossed the stage with practiced confidence, her handshake with Colbert lasting precisely long enough for photographers to capture the moment, but brief enough to establish boundaries. As she took her seat, adjusting slightly to ensure optimal camera framing, the analytical part of her mind registered the subtle repositioning of Colbert's chair, angled to assert dominance in a space he had controlled for nearly 2 decades. The audience settled, breath collectively held. In newsrooms across the country, political editors who had dismissed the booking as light entertainment now instructed junior reporters to draft analytical frameworks. On social media, clips were primed for dissemination before a word had been exchanged. What would follow in the next 42 minutes wouldn't merely be conversation. It would be generational proxy war, conducted with smiles and carefully calibrated talking points, a litmus test for how power was transferring in America's cultural institutions. Colbert leaned forward, his opening question poised like a rapier. Levitt's subtle smile in response suggested she had anticipated his approach before he had even conceived it. The battle for narrative control had begun, and with it, a new chapter in America's evolving relationship with political media. The cameras tightened on their faces as the first exchange loomed. Two worlds colliding with the force of tectonic plates, neither side fully comprehending how the landscape would be transformed when they finally pulled apart. The unexpected counterattack, Levitt's calculated response. The stage was set for what should have been a routine political skewering. Studio 50's audience settled into their seats, expectations firmly planted by years of watching Stephen Colbert dismantle conservative figures with surgical precision. The host's writers had prepared a volley of barbs aimed at the youngest press secretary in American history, each joke designed to reduce Karoline Leavitt to another punchline in late night's ongoing political theater. As the cameras rolled, Colbert deployed his opening salvo with practiced timing. His signature eyebrow arched as he unleashed his first line of attack, a carefully crafted remark dripping with condescension about Levitt's age and perceived inexperience. His studio audience responded with programmed laughter, the comfortable rhythm of ideological affirmation that had defined his show for years. "I suppose they've started appointing press secretaries straight out of student government now," Colbert quipped, his voice carrying that distinctive blend of mockery and feigned incredulity that had become his trademark. The trap was laid. A moment designed to force Levitt into either defensive posturing or awkward capitulation. It was a formula that had worked countless times before, with political guests unprepared for the unique pressures of entertainment media. What happened next sent ripples through the studio audience that would soon extend into the broader media landscape. Levitt didn't flinch. Instead, she leaned slightly forward, her posture relaxed but engaged. The millisecond pause before her response, imperceptible to casual viewers but glaring to media veterans, signaled something unexpected: preparation meeting opportunity. "Stephen," she began, her voice carrying neither the defensiveness of the ambushed nor the stiffness of talking points. "When you were my age, you were performing improv for audiences smaller than my high school graduation. I'm addressing the nation and international press corps daily. But please, continue explaining how youth equals inexperience." The audience's reaction transformed from dutiful laughter to genuine surprise, a wave of uncertain murmurs punctuated by scattered applause that wasn't supposed to be there. Network executives watching from the wings exchanged glances. This wasn't in the script. A flicker of recalibration crossed Colbert's face, the microsecond of recognition that skilled performers can't hide when the expected dynamic suddenly shifts. His planned follow-up suddenly seemed inadequate, forcing an improvisational pivot that left him momentarily exposed. "Well," he started, reaching for his water glass, buying precious seconds. But Levitt had seized the conversational momentum, continuing with the practiced ease of someone who fields hostile questions for a living. "Comedy and governance have something in common, Stephen. Timing is everything, and right now, it's time for voices like mine to be in the room." The camera caught a young woman in the front row nodding vigorously, phone raised to capture the moment, a visual metaphor for the generational realignment happening in real time. The applause that followed wasn't the polite acknowledgement of a good retort, it carried the energy of recognition, of witnessing a power shift. Colbert, veteran performer that he was, attempted to reassert control through his most reliable weapon, ironic detachment. "Well, I'm glad you've prepared some zingers for us tonight," he offered, trying to reduce her response to mere entertainment. "Not zingers, Stephen. Perspective." Levitt's reply landed without hostility, but with unmistakable firmness. In the control room, producers frantically adjusted their segment timing. What was planned as a 4-minute light exchange before transitioning to prepared talking points was clearly becoming something else entirely. The show's director signaled for cameras to capture more audience reactions, sensing the narrative was no longer contained within the host-guest dynamic but expanding to include the viewer's response. Colbert's producers, watching from the wings with growing concern, recognized the unmistakable signs of a host losing control of his platform. In an industry where perception shapes reality, the visuals told a devastating story. A Gen Z political figure wasn't just holding her own, she was commandeering the narrative on one of liberal entertainment's most protected stages. As the segment continued, media analysts across the political spectrum were already drafting their takes. What they all recognized, regardless of ideology, was that they were watching more than an interview. They were witnessing a generational changing of the guard, playing out through the proxy battle between an established media gatekeeper and a representative of political youth ascending to institutional power. The implications extended far beyond this single exchange. If the established gatekeepers of cultural commentary could be so effectively challenged on their own turf, what other power structures might soon find themselves similarly vulnerable? The commercial break couldn't come quickly enough for Colbert's team. But for America's political landscape, the real show was just beginning. The Challenger's Gambit. Levit seizes control. The third act of the evening unfolded with the precision of a political coup. What began as Colbert's carefully orchestrated intellectual ambush had transformed into Levit's masterclass in narrative judo. The young press secretary, having weathered the initial storm of condescension, now moved from defense to offense with calculated poise. Colbert's writers, veterans of countless political skirmishes, had failed to account for a critical variable. Levit wasn't playing by the established rulebook. While previous administration representatives had either matched hostility with hostility or retreated into talking points, she was executing a different strategy altogether, one that weaponized authenticity against irony. "Let's talk policy instead of personalities," Levit suggested, her tone carrying the confidence of someone who had studied the battlefield before entering it. Unless, of course, you find substance less entertaining than stereotypes. The audience's reaction registered like seismic activity on the studio monitors. Unexpected murmurs of approval rippled through sections typically reliable for progressive applause lines. Network executives, watching the metrics in real time, noted the unusual engagement patterns forming across demographic groups. "I've always found substance fascinating," Colbert countered, professional smile intact but eyes betraying the calculations happening behind them. The veteran host was recalibrating, adjusting to an opponent who refused to be reduced to the caricature his writers had prepared for. With each exchange, the power dynamic shifted almost imperceptibly. Colbert's questions grew incrementally more substantive, less reliant on punchlines, a tacit acknowledgement that his usual approach was yielding diminishing returns. Levit, meanwhile, maintained the steady rhythm of someone who understood that in media confrontations, composure is currency. "What your audience might not realize, Stephen," she continued, gesturing inclusively toward the studio crowd, "is that behind the partisan theater, there's a generation rising that's exhausted by the performance of politics without progress." A young woman in the front row nodded emphatically, her response caught by cameras and immediately flagged by the social media team as potential viral content. The moment crystallized the underlying tension. This wasn't merely host versus guest, but competing visions of political engagement colliding on primetime. Colbert, sensing the gravity shift, attempted to reassert control through humor, his home territory. "So you're saying I'm part of the problem?" he asked, eyebrow arched for the laugh that would normally follow. "I'm saying you're powerful enough to be part of the solution," Levit replied, sidestepping the trap while extending an unexpected olive branch that doubled as challenge. The studio temperature seemed to rise as audience members leaned forward in their seats. This wasn't the blood sport they had expected, but something potentially more compelling. Authentic discourse breaking through the hardened shell of entertainment politics. In the control booth, the segment producer made a critical decision, whispering into Colbert's earpiece, "Stay with this. Ratings are spiking." What the data showed in real time, and what political strategists would dissect for weeks afterward, was the audience's hunger for something beyond the predictable choreography of late-night political theater. Levit had transformed Colbert's stage into a platform for her generation's political awakening, and viewers across demographic lines were responding. "You know," Colbert said, momentarily dropping the persona that had defined his career, "most people come on this show expecting certain rules of engagement. Perhaps that's why most people leave this show exactly as they entered it," Levit observed, neither triumphant nor antagonistic, simply matter of fact. The audience's applause came without prompt cards or flashing lights, a spontaneous recognition that they were witnessing something authentic in an environment engineered for artifice. As the segment approached its conclusion, media analysts were already recording their initial verdicts. Conservative outlets would frame it as an establishment ambush thwarted. Progressive platforms would debate whether Colbert had given too much unchallenged ground. But the more nuanced reality was that both participants had been changed by the exchange. Levit had demonstrated that General Z's political voice didn't require validation from traditional gatekeepers to resonate. Colbert, meanwhile, had glimpsed the limitations of ironic detachment in an era increasingly defined by sincere engagement. As the studio lights dimmed for commercial break, the cameras caught a final, unscripted moment. Colbert leaning toward his guest with his microphone presumably dead, his expression suggesting the most authentic conversation might be the one about to happen off-air. The question hanging in the political atmosphere was whether this represented an isolated skirmish or the opening salvo in a broader realignment of media influence. The audience, still processing what they had witnessed, understood one thing clearly. They had seen more than an interview. They had glimpsed the changing of the guard. The turning tide, Levit's calculated composure, dismantles Colbert's control. The studio air grew electric as the intellectual chess match between Levitt and Colbert entered its most decisive phase. What had begun as standard late-night political theater was transforming into something altogether more consequential, a generational power shift, playing out under the harsh glare of studio lights. Colbert's body language betrayed the internal calculus happening behind his practiced smile. His fingers tapped rhythmically against his desk, a tell that media veterans recognized as his response to unexpected resistance. The late-night titan who had built his empire on the foundations of sardonic takedowns now found himself caught in rhetorical quicksand, each attempt to regain solid ground only pulling him deeper into unfamiliar territory. "I think we're missing the actual conversation Americans want to have," Levitt observed, her composure almost architectural in its precision. The camera caught her steady gaze, unwavering, neither combative nor deferential, as she continued, "This isn't about scoring points. It's about addressing the legitimate concerns of a generation inheriting unprecedented challenges." The studio audience, primed for partisan bloodsport, instead found themselves witnesses to something more complex. The expected applause lines and laughter cues fell away as genuine engagement took root. Network executives monitoring the feed noted with alarm that Colbert's tried-and-true rescue techniques, the sardonic eyebrow, the well-timed scoff, the cutaway to a prepared graphic, were proving ineffective against Levitt's methodical dismantling of the show's carefully constructed format. "Let's circle back to the policy question," Colbert attempted, shuffling his note cards in an uncharacteristic display of adjustment. The veteran host was implementing emergency protocols, seeking to redirect the conversation back to familiar shores, where his rhetorical arsenal could be deployed effectively. Levitt nodded, but her slight smile revealed the strategic advantage she now held. "Absolutely. But before we do, I think your audience deserves context for why these policies matter, beyond the partisan framework they're typically presented in." In the control booth, producers exchanged glances fraught with professional concern. The segment was veering dangerously close to substance over spectacle, territory that threatened the delicate balance of entertainment and information that defined the show's brand identity. Yet the metrics told an unexpected story. Viewer engagement was spiking, particularly in the coveted 18 to 34 demographic. "You know, in Washington we often talk about Gen Z voters as some monolithic entity," Levitt continued, skillfully widening the conversation to include the broader cultural moment. "What's happening instead is a sophisticated political awakening that transcends traditional partisan boundaries." Colbert's interruption, normally a tool of dominance, came a beat too late, landing as an unintentional confirmation of his diminishing command over the exchange. "Are you suggesting that your administration has somehow cornered the market on youth engagement?" "Not at all," Levitt countered, her response immediate yet unhurried. "I'm suggesting that both parties have fundamentally misunderstood what drives this generation's political involvement. It's not ideology, it's authenticity." The word hung in the studio air like a judgment. Authenticity. The very quality that late-night formula often sacrificed at the altar of predictable entertainment. The irony was not lost on media analysts who would later dissect the exchange. Colbert, whose early career was built on satirizing performative politics, now found himself outflanked by genuine political discourse. As the segment approached its scheduled conclusion, the power dynamic had irreversibly shifted. Colbert's questions grew increasingly straightforward, stripped of the ironic shell that typically protected him from accusations of bias. Levitt, meanwhile, maintained her poised delivery, neither gloating in her tactical advantage nor retreating into defensive postures. "We're almost out of time," Colbert noted, the standard closing gambit that usually signaled his final opportunity to deliver a memorably cutting remark. "Then let me leave your audience with this thought," Levitt responded, recognizing the closing window and seizing it with practiced precision. Beyond the headlines and soundbites, there's a conversation about America's future that deserves more than punchlines. The applause that followed wasn't the partisan approval Colbert's writers had engineered, but something more nuanced. Recognition of a moment when the carefully constructed artifice of political entertainment had been momentarily punctured by something resembling genuine exchange. As cameras prepared to cut away, Colbert's expression revealed the professional recalculation of a media veteran who recognized when adaptation was necessary. This wasn't merely a segment gone awry, it was a harbinger of shifting cultural currents that threatened to reshape the landscape he had so skillfully navigated for decades. The question lingering as the commercial break approached wasn't who had won the exchange, but whether the rules of engagement in America's political media culture had been permanently altered. In living rooms across the nation, viewers witnessed not just Colbert's temporary discomfort, but the emergence of a new paradigm in political communication, one where the carefully maintained barriers between authentic discourse and entertainment politics had begun to crumble. The turning tide, when the audience changed sides. As the intellectual duel between Levitt and Colbert reached its zenith, something unprecedented began to unfold in Studio 50. The audience, historically Colbert's reliable fortress of support, underwent a tectonic shift. Row by row, face by face, the crowd's allegiance began to fracture and reform before the network's watchful cameras. The transformation was subtle at first. Nervous laughter where uproarious approval should have been, thoughtful nods replacing dismissive scoffs. Then came the murmurs of agreement with Levitt's points, punctuated by scattered applause that emerged not at Colbert's cues, but at moments of Levitt's clearest articulation. The studio's carefully cultivated ecosystem of ideological comfort was experiencing a rare disruption. What we're witnessing is nothing short of a live audience realignment, a senior producer whispered into her headset, instructing camera operators to capture the shifting body language of the crowd. Get me reaction shots from sections 3 and 4. Colbert, a master of reading rooms, felt the ground moving beneath him. His decades of performance intuition registered the change like a seismograph detecting distant tremors. The host's eyes darted briefly to his executive producer standing off stage, whose tight-lipped expression confirmed the unthinkable. They were losing the room. I think what Ms. Levitt is suggesting, Colbert began, reaching for a lifeline of levity, but the attempted pivot was met with an audience now leaning forward in their seats, more interested in Levitt's response than his redirection. In the control room, panic mingled with fascination. The show's formula, built on the reliable mathematics of partisan entertainment, was being rewritten in real time. Directors frantically toggled between camera angles, searching for the visual narrative that could contextualize this unexpected development. Stay on Levitt, the director commanded, and get me crowd reaction, all of it. The cameras captured what would become the segment's defining imagery. Young audience members nodding in vigorous agreement, middle-aged viewers leaning toward companions in whispered conversation, and the unmistakable energy of a crowd experiencing a collective recalibration. Levitt, sensing the momentum shift, modulated her approach with surgical precision. Her words now carried the weight of majority support, allowing her to abandon defensive posturing for something more powerful, magnanimity and ascendance. I believe we're all seeking the same thing here, she offered, her voice carrying a conciliatory tone that only emphasized her newfound position of strength. A conversation that respects the intelligence of the American people, regardless of political affiliation. The applause that followed wasn't the polite acknowledgement of a guest talking point. It was the sound of conviction, of recognition, spreading through the studio like wildfire. Colbert, the consummate professional, executed the most difficult maneuver in his arsenal, adaptation under fire. His expression shifted from defensive humor to measured engagement, recognizing that salvaging the segment now required joining the new current rather than swimming against it. Let's explore that idea further, he pivoted, abandoning the pre-written questions on his cards. Because I think there's something happening here worth examining. In control rooms at rival networks, producers watched the live feed with stunned attention. The narrative of a Gen Z political figure being ritually sacrificed on the altar of late-night comedy was disintegrating before their eyes, replaced by something far more newsworthy, the emergence of a new voice capable of transcending the boundaries of entertainment politics. Are we watching Colbert lose control of his own show? A CNN producer texted to his executive producer. The response came quickly. No. We're watching American political media evolution in real time. Book analysts for the morning. All of them. As the segment approached its conclusion, the studio's energy had transformed from anticipatory amusement to engaged respect. Audience members who had arrived expecting confirmation of their political biases were departing with something far more valuable: questions about their assumptions. Production assistants hurriedly passed notes to Colbert, suggesting extensions to the segment to capitalize on the unexpected chemistry developing on stage. Ratings were spiking across demographics, with particularly strong numbers among the coveted 18 to 34 age group that advertisers paid premium rates to reach. Levit's final point landed with the precision of a veteran performer, rather than a political appointee. Perhaps what tonight demonstrates is that Americans are hungry for substance over spectacle, for dialogue over division. The applause that followed wasn't merely supportive, it was cathartic, as if the audience had been unknowingly waiting for permission to break from prescribed response patterns. As the control room prepared to cut to commercial, network executives were already sketching the contours of a narrative that could frame this unexpected development as intentional rather than accidental. By morning, press releases would describe the segment as a bold experiment in cross-partisan dialogue, rather than acknowledge the unthinkable: that for 8 minutes and 42 seconds, the carefully maintained architecture of late-night political entertainment had been fundamentally challenged. What no one in the studio could fully process in that moment was how this shift would reverberate beyond a single broadcast. As audience members reached for their phones to share their experience on social media, the first tremors of a larger cultural earthquake were already being felt. For Colbert, the path forward would require recalibration. For Leavitt, it marked the emergence of a new kind of political communication, one where authenticity trumped artifice, even in the most controlled media environments. And for the political media establishment watching from afar, a sobering reality was taking shape. The rules of engagement had changed, and the audience was embracing the new game. The reversal, when the audience changed sides. In the harsh glare of studio lighting, the unthinkable was unfolding. Stephen Colbert, the undisputed king of late-night political satire, found himself losing ground on his own territory. What began as a routine segment designed to showcase the host's trademark wit at the expense of a young White House press secretary had transformed into something far more consequential. Karoline Leavitt stood her ground as Colbert's carefully constructed arguments began to crumble. The host had deployed his usual arsenal, sharp sarcasm wrapped in the veneer of comedic inquiry, but against Levit, these weapons proved surprisingly ineffective. "I believe we need to address the substance of the policy, not just the headlines," Levit countered, her composure unwavering despite the pressure of being under the studio's hot lights. The response struck a chord that reverberated through the venue. Colbert's audience, typically a reliable chorus of approval for his political positions, began to fracture before the cameras. The network executives watching from the shadows of the control room shifted uncomfortably as they witnessed the unmistakable signs of a narrative slipping from their grasp. "Cut to camera 3, the director ordered frantically, hoping to capture Colbert's recovery rather than the audience's unexpected reaction to Leavitt's points. But there was no recovery to frame. Colbert, sensing the room's changing allegiance, attempted to redirect with humor. "Well, I think what we're all wondering is," he began, only to be met with a tepid response where uproarious laughter should have been. Levit seized the opening, with the instinct of a political operative who recognized the rare moment when public perception hung in the balance. "The American people deserve more than sound bites and punchlines," she stated, making direct eye contact with audience members who now leaned forward in their seats. "They deserve leaders who address their concerns with honesty, regardless of how it plays on late-night television." The control room erupted in whispered panic. "We're losing them," the executive producer muttered. "He needs to take back the segment now." Colbert, a veteran performer with decades of experience, recognized the shifting winds. His expression, typically confident and controlled, betrayed a momentary flash of something rarely seen on camera: recalibration. The studio audience, comprising predominantly liberal New Yorkers who had stood in line for hours to witness Colbert's political theater, were now responding to Leavitt with nods of approval and spontaneous applause that wasn't part of the show's choreography. "What we're witnessing," a media analyst would later observe on CNN's morning broadcast, "is the visual representation of General Z's political ascendance." Leavitt didn't just hold her own, she converted Colbert's audience through authentic engagement rather than performative partisanship. As the segment progressed, Colbert's attempts to undermine Leavitt through humor increasingly fell flat. Each point she articulated resonated with clarity that transcended political lines, making his interjections seem increasingly like desperate attempts to maintain control rather than substantive rebuttals. The data simply doesn't support that assertion. Levitt responded to one of Colbert's claims, producing figures that directly contradicted his argument. The reaction was immediate. The audience's surprised murmurs spoke volumes about expectations versus reality. In the network's executive offices, phones began lighting up as social media metrics revealed the segment was gaining unprecedented traction online. The hashtag #LevittTakesOver began trending within minutes, accompanied by clip after clip of her most powerful moments. "This isn't damage control anymore," the network's digital director informed her superiors. "This is a full narrative reversal happening in real time." By the segment's conclusion, what had begun as Colbert's attempt to score political points through humorous dismantling of a young press secretary had transformed into a makeshift rally for Leavitt's perspective. The studio audience, who had arrived expecting confirmation of their existing beliefs, departed with something far more valuable, and for the network, far more dangerous: genuine consideration of alternative viewpoints. "I appreciate the opportunity for this discussion," Levitt concluded, her words carrying the weight of victory rather than the relief of a guest who had survived an antagonistic interview. "I think we've demonstrated that meaningful dialogue across political differences isn't just possible, it's what Americans are hungry for." As the cameras prepared to cut away, Colbert's expression betrayed the recognition of a fundamental shift. The unspoken rules of political entertainment had been challenged, not by network executives or focus groups, but by something far more potent: authenticity that resonated across partisan lines. For a moment, as the applause rose to fill the studio, neither the host nor the network knew exactly what would come next. But one thing was certain: the ecosystem of political media had just experienced a tremor, whose aftershocks would reshape the landscape far beyond a single late-night segment. Behind the scenes, as production assistants rushed to prepare for the commercial break, no one spoke the obvious truth. Tonight, Goliath had fallen, and a new chapter in political communication had been written before a live studio audience. The question remaining wasn't whether the moment would be remembered, but how the establishment would respond to its implications. The final blow: how a generation found its voice. As the confrontation reached its crescendo, the studio fell into a hushed anticipation. What had begun as Colbert's home field advantage had transformed into contested territory, with battle lines redrawn with each exchange. Now all eyes fixed on Karoline Leavitt as she prepared to deliver her closing statement. The young press secretary stood with the composure of someone twice her age, her posture betraying none of the pressure that typically crushed political figures under the studio's merciless lights. The producers, huddled in their control room sanctuary, exchanged nervous glances. This wasn't in the script. The metrics on their screens told a story none had anticipated. Viewer engagement spiking, social media igniting, the invisible digital audience growing exponentially as clips of the exchange spread like wildfire across platforms. "In closing," Leavitt began, her voice steady and resolute, "I think what we've witnessed tonight is precisely why so many young Americans have lost faith in mainstream media." The words hung in the air, not as an accusation, but as a simple statement of fact. The audience, predominantly liberal New Yorkers, who had lined up for hours to witness Colbert's renowned political evisceration, shifted uncomfortably in their seats. "We don't need to be told what to think," she continued, making deliberate eye contact with viewers through the camera lens. "We need spaces where ideas can be discussed honestly, where data matters more than delivery, and where substance isn't sacrificed for sound bites." Colbert, sensing the gravity of the moment, attempted to interject with a quip about generational divides, but his timing faltered. The joke landed with an almost audible thud as Levitt continued, unperturbed. "My generation has been dismissed, underestimated, and mischaracterized by the very institutions that claim to champion diversity of thought," she articulated, her words cutting through the studio's tense atmosphere. "Yet here we stand, more politically engaged than any generation before us, demanding not ideological comfort, but intellectual honesty." In the control booth, an executive producer whispered into his headset, "Are we seeing this? She's turning them." His colleague nodded silently, transfixed by the audience monitor where expressions of begrudging respect had replaced the partisan dismissal that typically characterized these encounters. "The ratings are unprecedented," the network's digital director reported in real time. "This is crossing demographic barriers we haven't bridged in years." Levitt's words continued to resonate, each sentence landing with the precision of artillery fire on the battlefield of public opinion. "When you mock rather than engage, when you caricature rather than characterize, when you dismiss rather than debate, you don't diminish us. You simply confirm why new voices like mine are necessary. The camera captured a moment of genuine reflection on Colbert's face, the rare naked vulnerability of a performer confronting an unexpected truth. His expression betrayed a complex calculus, the tension between professional instinct to reclaim control and intellectual recognition of a legitimate challenge to his perspective. I respect this platform and what it represents in American culture, Levitt concluded, her tone softening slightly but losing none of its conviction. But tonight has demonstrated why monopolies, even intellectual ones, eventually face disruption. My generation isn't asking for permission to participate in the conversation, we're simply changing its terms. The applause that followed wasn't the orchestrated response of a loyal audience following cues. It erupted organically, spreading through the studio like a revelation, tentative at first, then building into something undeniable. Even those who disagreed with her politics recognized the significance of the moment. They had witnessed not just a political exchange but a cultural inflection point, the torch of influence being grasped, not passed. Colbert, consummate professional that he was, nodded in acknowledgement. "Well," he said, searching for words that wouldn't come easily, "I think we've all gotten more than we bargained for tonight." The camera pulled back to reveal an audience transformed, some nodding in agreement, others in visible discomfort, but all engaged in a way that transcended typical partisan performance. This wasn't entertainment anymore. It was witness to a shifting landscape. In newsrooms across the country, editors scrambled to reframe their pre-written narratives about the exchange. What was supposed to be a routine political skirmish, established host puts young upstart in her place, had become something else entirely. A case study in generational transition and media disruption. What we're seeing, a network analyst would later explain, is the visualization of what polling has been telling us for years. Gen Z doesn't just want different policies, they want a fundamental redesign of how political conversations happen. As the segment concluded and the studio lights dimmed, the implications radiated outward. For the mainstream media establishment, Levitt's performance wasn't just a singular defeat, but a harbinger of transformation. The monopoly on narrative framing, long enjoyed by traditional gatekeepers, faced its most significant challenge not from technology or market forces, but from a generational shift in expectations. In the green room, as production assistants exchanged wide-eyed glances, the unspoken question hung in the air. If this is what one voice could accomplish in 15 minutes of airtime, what would happen when an entire generation found its collective voice? The answer would come sooner than anyone anticipated.